Hello, and this is Morale Bernard with the continuing story of White Christmas with the Browns. White Christmas with the Browns, and Mrs. Brown, I believe, was in some trouble. Last words were the picture which presented itself to her mind as to his probable conduct was so terrible that she found herself unable to incur the risk. Then an idea presented itself to her mind. We all know how in a moment quick thoughts will course through the subtle brain. She would find that porter and send him to explain it all. There should be no concealment now. She would tell the story and would bid him to find the necessary aid. Alas! As she told herself that she would do so, she knew well that she was only running from the danger which it was her duty to encounter. Once again, she put out her hand as though to return along the bed. Then thrice he snorted, louder than before, and moved up his knee uneasily beneath the clothes as though the sharpness of the mustard were already working upon his skin. She watched him for a moment longer, and then, with a candle in her hand, she fled. Poor human nature. Had he been an old man, even a middle-aged man, she would not have left him to his unmerited sufferings. As it was, though, she completely recognised her duty and knew what justice and goodness demanded of her. She could not do it. But there was still left to her that plan of sending the night porter to him. It was not till she was out of the room and had gently closed the door behind her that she began to bethink herself how she had made the mistake. With a glance of her eye, she looked up, and then saw the number on the door, 353. Remarking to herself with a Brighton's natural criticism on things French, that those horrid foreigners do not know how to make their figures, she scudded rather than ran along the corridor, and then down some stairs and along another passage, so that she might not be found in the neighbourhood should the poor man, in his agony, rush rapidly from his bed. In the confusion of her first escape, she hardly ventured to look for her own passage, nor did she in the least know how she had lost her way when she came upstairs with the mustard in her hand. But at the present moment her chief object was the night porter. She went on, descending, till she came again to that vestibule, and looking up at the clock saw that it was now past 1. It was not yet midnight when she left her husband, but she was not at all astonished at the lapse of time. It seemed to her as though she had passed a night among these miseries. And oh, what a night! But there was yet much to be done. She must find that porter, and then return to her own suffering husband. Ah, what now should she say to him? If he should really be ill, how should she assuage him? And yet, how more than ever necessary was it that they should leave that hotel early in the morning, that they should leave Paris by the very earliest and quickest train that would take them as fugitives from their present dangers. The door of the salon was open, but she had no courage to go in search of a second supply. She would have lacked strength to carry it up the stairs. Where now, oh, where was that man? From the vestibule she made her way into the hall, but everything seemed to be deserted. Through the glass she could see a light in the court beyond, but she could not bring herself to endeavour even to open the hall doors. And now she was very cold, chilled to her very bones. All this had been done at Christmas, and during such severity of weather as had never before been experienced by living Parisians. A feeling of great pity for herself gradually came upon her. What wrong had she done that she should be so grievously punished? Why should she be driven to wander about in this way till her limbs were failing her? And then so absolutely important as it was that her strength should support her in the morning. The man would not die, even though he were left there without aid, to rid himself of the cataplasm as best he might. Was it absolutely necessary that she should disgrace herself? But she could not even procure the means of disgracing herself, if that telling her story to the night porter would have been a disgrace. She did not find him, and at last resolved to make her way back to her own room without further quest. She began to think that she had done all that she could do. No man was ever killed by a mustard plaster on his throat. His discomfort, at the worst, would not be worse than hers had been, or too probably than that of her poor husband. So she went back up the stairs and along the passages, and made her way on this occasion to the door of her room without any difficulty. The way was so well known to her that she could not but wonder that she had failed before. But now her hands had been empty, and her eyes had been at her full command. She looked up, and there was the number. Very manifest of this occasion, 333. She opened the door most gently, thinking that her husband might be sleeping as soundly as that other man had slept, and she crept into the room. But her husband was not sleeping. He was not even in the bed, as she had left him. She found him sitting there before the fireplace, on which one half-burned log still retained a spark of what had once pretended to be a fire. Nothing more wretched than his appearance could be imagined. There was a single lighted candle on the table, on which he was leaning with his two elbows, while his head rested between his hands. He had on a dressing gown over his nightshirt, but otherwise was not clothed. He shivered audibly, or rather shook himself with the cold, and made the table to chatter as she entered the room. Then he groaned and let his head fall from his hands onto the table. It occurred to her at the moment, as she recognized the tone of his quarrelsome voice, and as she saw the form of his neck, that she must have been deaf and blind when she had mistaken that stalwart stranger for her husband. "Oh, my dear," she said, "why are you not in bed?" He answered nothing in words, but only groaned again. "Why did you get up? I left you warm and comfortable." "Where have you been all night?" he half whispered, half croaked, with an agonizing effort. "I've been looking for the mustard. I've been looking all night, and I haven't found it. Where have you been?" She refused to speak a word to him till she had got him into bed, and she then told her story. But alas, that which she told was not the true story. As she was persuading him to go back to his rest, and while she arranged the clothes again around him, she with difficulty made up her mind as to what she would do and what she would say. Living or dying, he must be made to start for Thompson Hall at 5:30 on the next morning. It was no longer a question of the amenities of Christmas, no longer a mere desire to satisfy the family ambition of her own people, no longer an anxiety to see her new brother-in-law. She was conscious that there was in that house one whom she had been deeply injured, and from whose vengeance, even from whose aspect, she must fly. How could she endure to see that face, which she was so well sure that she would recognize, or to hear the slightest sound of that voice, which would be quite familiar to her ears, though it had never spoken a word in her hearing? She must certainly fly on the wings of the earliest train, which would carry her toward the old house. But in order that she might do so, she must propitiate her husband. So she told her story. She had gone forth, as he had bade her, in search of the mustard, and then had suddenly lost her way. Up and down the house she had wandered, perhaps nearly a dozen times. Had she met no one? He asked in that raspy, husky whisper. Surely there must have been someone about the hotel. Nor was it possible that she could have been roaming about all those hours. Only 1 hour, my dear, she said. Then there was a question about the duration of time in which both of them waxed angry. And as she became angry, her husband waxed stronger, and as he became violent beneath the clothes, the comfortable idea returned to her that he was not perhaps so ill as he would seem to be. She found herself driven to tell him something about the porter, having to account for that lapse of time by explaining how she had driven the poor man to search for the handkerchief, which she had never lost. Why did you not tell him you wanted the mustard? My dear, why not? There is nothing to be ashamed of in wanting mustard. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't do it. To tell you the truth, he wasn't very civil, and I thought that he was, perhaps, a little tipsy. Now, my dear, do go to sleep. Why didn't you get the mustard? There was none there, nowhere at all about the room. I went down again and searched everywhere. That's what took me so long. They always lock up those kind of things at these French hotels. They are too close-fisted to leave anything out. When you first spoke of it, I knew that it would be gone when I got there. Now, my dear, do go to sleep, because we positively must start in the morning. That is impossible, said he, jumping up in the bed. We must go, my dear. I say that we must go. After all that has passed, I wouldn't not be with Uncle John and my cousin Robert tomorrow evening for more than I would venture to say. Bother, he exclaimed. It's all very well for you to say that, Charles, but you don't know. I say that we must go tomorrow, and we will. I do believe you want to kill me, Mary. Oh, that's very cruel, Charles, and more false and most unjust. As for making you ill, nothing could be so bad for you as this wretched place, where nobody can get warm either day or night. If anything will cure your throat for you at once, it will be the sea air. And only think how much more comfortable they can make you at Thompson Hall than anywhere in this country. I have so set my heart upon it, Charles, that I will do it. If we are not there by tomorrow night, Uncle John won't consider us as belonging to the family. I don't believe a word of it. Jane told me so in a letter. I wouldn't let you know before because I thought it so unjust. But that has been the reason why I've been so earnest about it all through. It was 1,000 pities that so good a woman should have been driven by the sad stress of circumstances to tell so many fibs. One after another, she was compelled to invent them, that there might be a way open to her of escaping the horrors of a prolonged sojourn in that hotel. At length, after much grumbling, he became silent, and she trusted that he was sleeping. He had not as yet said that he would start at the required hour in the morning, but she was perfectly determined in her own mind that he should be made to do so. as he lay there motionless, and as she wandered about the room pretending to pack her things, she more than once almost resolved that she would tell him everything. Surely, then he would be ready to make any effort. But there came upon her an idea that he might perhaps fail to see all the circumstances, and that so failing, he would insist on remaining, that he might tender some apology to the injured gentleman. An apology might have been very well had she not left him there in his misery. But what apology would be possible now? She would have to see him and speak to him, and everyone in the hotel would know every detail of the story. Everyone in France would know that it was she who had gone to the strange man's bedside and put the mustard plaster on the strange man's throat in the dead of night. She could not tell the story, even to her husband, lest even her husband should betray her. Her own sufferings at the present moment were not light. In her perturbation of mind, she had foolishly resolved that she would not herself go to bed. The tragedy of the night had seemed to her too deep for personal comfort. And then, how would it be were she to sleep and have no one to call her? It was imperative that she should have all her powers ready for thoroughly arousing him. It occurred to her that the servant of the hotel would certainly run her too short of time. She had to work for herself and for him too, and therefore she would not sleep. But she was very cold, and she put on first a shawl over her dressing gown, and then a cloak. She could not consume all the remaining hours of the night in packing one bag and one portmanteau, so that at last she sat down on the narrow red cotton velvet sofa, and looking at her watch, perceived that, as yet, it was not much past 2 o'clock. How was she to get through those other 3 long, tedious, chilly hours? Then there came a voice from the bed. "Ain't you coming?" "I hoped you were asleep, my dear." "I haven't been asleep at all. You'd better come if you don't mean to make yourself as ill as I am." "You are not so very bad, are you, darling?" "I don't know what you call bad. I never felt my throat so choked in my life before." Still, as she listened, she thought that she remembered his throat to have been more choked. If the husband of her bosom could play with her feelings and deceive her on such an occasion as this, then she thought that she would rather not have any husband of her bosom at all. But she did creep into bed and lay down beside him without saying another word. Of course she slept, but her sleep was not the sleep of the best. At every striking of the clock in the quadrangle, she would start up in alarm, fearing that she had let the time go by. Though the night was so short, it was very long to her. But he slept like an infant. She could hear from his breathing that he was not quite so well as she could wish him to be, but still he was resting in beautiful tranquillity. Not once did he move when she started up, as she did so frequently. Orders had been given and repeated over and over again that they should be called at 5. The man in the office had almost been angry as he assured Mrs. Brown for the 4th time that Monsieur and Madame would most assuredly be wakened at the appointed time. But still she would trust to no one, and was up and about the room before the clock had struck 4:30. In her heart of hearts, she was very tender toward her husband. Now, In order that he might feel a gleam of warmth while he was dressing himself, she collected together the fragments of half-burned wood and endeavoured to make a little fire. Then she took out from her bag a small pot and a patent lamp and some chocolate, and prepared for him a warm drink so that he might have it instantly as he was awakened. She would do anything for him in the way of ministering to his comfort. Only he must go. Yes, he certainly must go. And then she wondered how that strange man was bearing himself at the present moment. She would fain have ministered to him too, had it been possible, but it was impossible. Probably before this he would have been aroused from his troubled slumbers. But then, how aroused? At what time in the night would the burning heat upon his chest have awakened him to a sense of torture which must have been so altogether incomprehensible to him? Her strong imagination showed to her a clear picture of the scene, clear, though it must have been done in the dark. How he must have tossed and hurled himself onto the clothes. How those strong knees must have worked themselves up and down before the potent god of sleep would allow him to return to perfect consciousness. How his fingers, restrained by no reason, would have trampled over his feverish throat, scattering everywhere that unhappy poultice. Then, when he should have sat up, wide awake, but still in the dark, with her mind's eyes she saw it all, feeling that some fire, as from the infernal regions, had fallen upon him, and whence he would not know, how fiercely wild would be the working of his spirit. Now she knew, now she felt, now she acknowledged how bound she had been to awaken him at the moment, whatever might have been the personal inconvenience to herself. In such a position, that would he do, or rather what had he done? She could follow much of it in her own thoughts. How he would scramble madly from his bed, and with one hand still on his throat would snatch hurriedly at the matches with the other. How the light would come, and how then he would rush to the mirror. What a sight he would behold! She could see it all, to the last widespread daub. Oh, join me. Join me for White Christmas with the Browns. Join me for the continuing story of White Christmas with the Browns. And please, by the way, subscribe to these videos. Please share. Join me for the next video of White Christmas with Mrs. Brown. Okay, bye.